The phone rang at 6:47 in the morning. Roy Callum was already at the kitchen table with his coffee, the way he had been every morning for 46 years because that was the kind of man he was. And the farm did not care what kind of man you were. It only cared whether you showed up. The light outside the window above the sink was the gray of early March in Iowa. The particular gray that is not quite dark and not quite light, but something in between that has not yet decided what it intends to become. He looked at the phone on the table. His daughter's name was on the screen. He picked it up. June said, "Dad, are you sitting down?" He said he was. She said, "There is an auction notice in the Madison County Gazette this morning. Page 4, lower right corner. They are auctioning the south half of your property. Today, 10 o'clock, at the courthouse steps in Winterset." Roy did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the window. The gray outside had not changed. It was still the gray of something that had not yet decided. He said, "Who is selling it?" She said, "Something called Clearwater Title Group, LLC. "Dad, I have never heard of them." He said, "Neither have I." She said, "Can they do that? Can they auction your land without telling you?" Roy said no. They cannot. He ended the call. He set the phone down on the table. He looked at his coffee. He had not touched it since the phone rang, and it was already cooling. He picked it up and drank from it anyway because wasting coffee was a habit he had never allowed himself. And he was not going to start now. Not at 74 years old. Not on a Tuesday morning in March with 3 hours and 13 minutes until someone tried to sell the south half of his family's ground. He drove to the Casey's in Winterset and bought a copy of the Madison County Gazette. He stood in the parking lot in his coat and read the notice where it was page 4, lower right. The legal description was the south 120 acres of the Callum property, the parcel his grandfather George had broken in 1928. The seller was listed as Clearwater Title Group, LLC, a name Roy had never seen before this morning. The opening bid was listed at $400,000. He folded the paper. He put it in his coat pocket. He drove home. He did not drive fast. There was no point in driving fast. What needed to happen in the next 3 hours would happen, or it would not. And arriving at the farm 4 minutes sooner was not going to change the weight of what he was about to do. He drove the county road at the speed he always drove it, which was the speed of a man who knows this particular stretch of road, the way he knows his own hands, every curve and low crossing, and the place near the Henderson's old fence line, where the blacktop buckled each spring and had to be watched. At the kitchen table, he called Frank Arden. Frank was 63 years old, semi-retired, and had handled the legal work on Helen's estate when she died in 2019. He was not the kind of lawyer who wore expensive suits or drove to Des Moines for conferences. He was the kind of lawyer who had been in Madison County for 31 years and knew which clerks to call and which courthouse hallways to walk down when you needed something done in a county that was small enough that things still got done by people who remembered your name. Roy read him the notice. Frank was quiet on the line for a moment. He said, "Roy, I have to ask you straight. Is there any possibility of a lien you don't know about? An old mortgage, an unpaid tax, anything that might have given someone a legal basis to move on this?" Roy said no. His grandfather had paid cash for the ground in 1928. His father had paid the inheritance taxes in 1956, and again when he passed the land to Roy in 1981. Roy had paid property taxes on every acre of the Callum farm on time for 44 years without exception. There was no lien. Frank said, then this is fraud or it is a clerical error of a kind I have never personally encountered. Either way, the auction is at 10. We have less than 3 hours. Bring whatever paperwork you have. Bring everything. I will meet you at the courthouse at 9:30. Roy said he understood. He hung up. He sat at the kitchen table for a moment. Then he stood and walked down the hall and stopped at the door of the room that had been Helen's sewing room. He opened the door. The room was the same as it had been since 2019. He had not changed anything. He was not the kind of man who changed things that did not need changing. And this room did not need changing. Helen's sewing table stood against the far wall under the window. Her chair was pulled out slightly from the table at an angle the way she always left it when she stood up in the middle of something. On the table, a wicker basket with a half-finished piece of knitting still on the needles, the yarn the color of a faded afternoon sky. He had not moved the basket either. The shelf ran along the top of the closet. He could see the tube from where he stood. It was a cardboard tube, perhaps 2 feet long, capped at both ends with metal caps that had gone slightly soft with age. The cardboard itself had yellowed at the ends and softened along the seams. It had been on that shelf since 1981, which was 44 years, which was longer than some men lived. He pulled Helen's chair out the rest of the way and sat down in it. He had not sat in this chair since she died. It was lower than he expected. Or perhaps he had simply forgotten. He reached up and took the tube from the shelf and set it on the sewing table in front of him. He did not open it yet. He sat in Helen's chair in Helen's sewing room and looked at the tube. The morning light came through the window at a low angle, the thin March light that was still working out what it wanted to be. The room smelled of something he could not name precisely, which was the smell of a room that belonged to someone who was no longer in it. The particular combination of fabric and old wood, and a trace of the gardenia soap Helen had used every morning of the 38 years they were married. He reached into his coat pocket and took out the Gazette. He set it on the table beside the tube. He looked at the two things together for a moment. Then he looked at the wicker basket. He had looked at that basket many times in 6 years. He had never touched it. He did not know why he reached for it now, whether it was the morning or the tube, or the sound of June's voice on the phone, or simply the accumulation of sitting in Helen's chair for the first time. He lifted the basket and set it in his lap. The knitting was on top. Beneath the knitting were 2 balls of yarn. Beneath the yarn at the bottom of the basket, his fingers found an envelope. It was a standard white envelope, the kind that comes in a box of 50 from the hardware store. It was sealed and had not been opened. In the upper right corner, in Helen's handwriting, she had written 2003. In the center, she had written one word, which was Roy. He held it for a moment. He set the basket on the table. He held the envelope. Helen had put this here in 2003, which was 22 years ago, which was 16 years before she died, which meant she had known it was here for all of that time and had never mentioned it. He thought about that. He thought about what it meant to put something in a place and leave it there for 16 years without saying a word about it. And he understood it the way he understood most things about Helen, which was completely and without needing it explained. She had known he would find it when he needed to find it. She had trusted that. She had not said anything because saying something would have meant opening the conversation. And opening the conversation would have meant putting pressure on a decision that was his to make in his own time. She had confirmed what she needed to confirm, put the proof where he could find it, and gone back to knitting. He opened the envelope. Inside were 2 things. The first was a photocopy of a page from the Madison County Gazette from September of 1932. The article was short. 3 paragraphs of notice about a survey completed on the Callum property by a surveyor named R.L. Whitmore, confirming that a boundary dispute along the south parcel had been resolved in the landowner's favor. The second was a piece of paper in Helen's handwriting. It said, "The Whitmore survey is real. I found the 1932 article at the library. The line on the map is the correct line. You do not need to open the tube until you do." He sat with those 2 pieces of paper in his hands for a while. Then he set them down, picked up the tube, and removed the metal cap from the near end. The cap came off with a small sound. A breath of air that had been inside the tube since some year he could not determine. He tilted the tube, and a roll of paper slid out tied with a piece of brown string. There was also underneath the rolled paper a folded sheet of stationery that slid out separately and landed on the sewing table. He untied the string first. He unrolled the paper on the table using the tube and the Gazette and the wicker basket to hold the corners flat. It was a map, hand-drawn in black ink on drafting paper. The kind of careful, precise work that a professional man produces when he intends his work to outlast him. The lines were ruled with a straight edge. The measurements were written in a small, exact hand. In the lower right corner, a legend identified the surveyor as R.L. Whitmore, licensed Madison County, Iowa, and the date as April 11th, 1932. The map showed the full layout of the Callum property, all 640 acres, with each boundary marked and measured. In the bottom section, the south boundary of the property was drawn with a solid line and annotated with coordinates in the careful notation of a man who trusted numbers over descriptions. Roy was not a surveyor, but he was a farmer, and before that a mechanic and a man who had spent 50 years understanding the relationship between a diagram and the physical world it described, could read a survey map well enough to understand what he was looking at. The south boundary on Whitmore's 1932 map did not match the south boundary on the current county plat. The line ran further south by what the annotations suggested was nearly 1/4 of a mile. Whitmore had drawn the correct line and had documented it precisely, and had handed the original to George Callum, who had put it in a tube and put the tube on a shelf and told his son not to sell the south half and not to forget that the reason was in the tube. Roy picked up the folded stationery. He unfolded it. The handwriting was his grandfather's. He recognized it from the one letter he had ever seen from George, a letter written in 1954 to Roy's father about a drainage problem along the north field, which Roy had found in the filing cabinet in the barn office years ago. The handwriting was the same angular and deliberate, the writing of a man who held a pen the way he held everything with intention. The note said this: "In 1928, I paid McClum for the south boundary as he described it to me, and I paid him full price for it. But the description he gave the recorder's office was not the description he gave me, and I knew when I signed that something was not right with the line. I waited 4 years before I hired Whitmore because I needed to be certain before I made any claim." Whitmore confirmed the line I was paid for. I showed his survey to the county, and they told me the record was what it was, and changing it would require a court process I could not afford at that time. So I kept Whitmore's map and I kept quiet, and I told Thomas not to sell the south half, because the south half is not what the county says it is. It is what Whitmore's map says it is. If anyone ever comes for it, the map is the answer. George Callum. September 14th, 1932. Roy set the note down. He looked at the map. He looked at the note. He looked at Helen's 2 pieces of paper. His grandfather had paid for that line in 1928. He had known from the beginning that the county records were wrong. He had documented the correct boundary in 1932. and put the proof in a tube and trusted the next man to understand why it mattered and to keep the instruction without needing to understand everything behind it. His father, Thomas, had kept the instruction for 25 years and passed it to Roy without explanation because the instruction was enough. And the explanation was in the tube, and the tube was available if it was ever needed. His wife, Helen, had quietly confirmed the map's validity in 2003 without saying a word to Roy because she understood that the decision to open the tube or not to open it belonged to Roy. And she was not going to take it from him. And Roy had kept the instruction for 44 years across 4 attempts to sell him off the South. Half. And now he was sitting in Helen's chair in Helen's sewing room with the answer in his hands and 172 minutes until someone tried to auction the ground his grandfather had paid for in full in the spring of 1928. He rolled the map carefully along its original curl. He tied the string. He folded George's note and Helen's note together and put them in his shirt pocket. He put the Whitmore map back in the tube and replaced the cap. He stood up from Helen's chair. He was at the door when he stopped. He turned and looked at the room one more time. The sewing table, the basket, the chair pushed back at the angle she always left it. He looked at these things the way a man looks at something he is not quite ready to leave. Then he picked up the tube and walked out to the truck. Now, let me tell you something about the south 120 acres of the Callum farm. Because understanding what it was is understanding what Roy was walking toward that morning. George Callum had come to Madison County in 1924 from a family in central Illinois that had been farming since before the Civil War. He was 29 years old when he arrived, and he had saved money for 4 years working on other men's equipment, which was how he had learned that the difference between good machinery and bad machinery was not the age of the parts, but the attention of the man who maintained them. He arrived in Madison County with enough cash to look seriously at what was available and enough sense to look for a long time before deciding. He found the McCullum place in the spring of 1928, 640 acres rolling ground, a creek running through the northeast corner. Good bottomland in the south sections that had been cropped hard for 20 years and needed rest, but was not damaged. He walked every acre before he made an offer. He walked the boundaries twice. He asked McCullum to show him the corners. McCullum showed him the north boundary and the east boundary and the west boundary. He said the south boundary ran along an old fence line that had been there since his father's time. George walked it. He walked it twice. He measured his strides. He had learned to pace distances accurately in the years he spent working with equipment because knowing where something was in relation to something else was essential to the work. And you could not always trust a ruler when you were in the middle of a field. When he paced the south boundary along McCullum's fence line, and then paced the distance from the farmhouse to that fence line and back to the north road, the numbers did not add up to 640 acres. They added up to something less. He did not say anything to McCullum about this. He made an offer. He paid the price they agreed on. He had the deed filed with the county recorder's office, and then for 4 years he thought about the south fence line. He could not afford Whitmore in 1928 or 1929 or 1930. The early years of the Depression arrived with the efficiency of a bad frost, and men who had been solvent in September of 1929 were careful by December of the same year. George was careful by disposition, which meant he was better positioned than most. But surveying was not what he spent money on in those years. By 1932, he had enough. He hired R.L. Whitmore on a Monday in March, and they walked the property together for 3 days. Whitmore used a transit and a chain, and he took his time, which was the kind of surveyor George respected. At the end of the 3 days, Whitmore gave him the map and told him the south boundary was short by approximately a quarter mile along its full length. George took the map to the county recorder's office. The man behind the counter looked at it and said, "The deed as filed showed the legal description as McClum had provided it, and that changing a recorded deed was a legal process that required a court filing and potentially a quiet title action, and George would need a lawyer." George thanked him and went home. He could not afford a lawyer either. What he could afford was a cardboard tube and a cap for each end, and the patience to wait for a time that was not now. He told Thomas in 1956, when Thomas was 34 years old and taking over the farm because George's health was failing. He said not to sell the south half. He said the reason was in the tube. Thomas asked why he had not taken it to court. George said there had not been a time when the cost of the fight was worth less than the cost of the land. He said that time might come and the tube would be ready when it did. Thomas held the instruction for 25 years. He passed it to Roy in 1981 with one sentence and no further explanation, which was not because Thomas was a withholding man, but because he understood that the instruction was sufficient and the explanation was available, and giving Roy everything at once would have been a form of not trusting him to find the rest himself. Roy held the instruction for 44 years. He held it through 4 conversations with men who wanted to buy or lease or develop the South, half 4 conversations in which he said no without explaining why, because he did not think an explanation was owed. He was not holding the ground for profit. He was holding it because his father had told him to hold it, and his father had known something Roy did not yet know. And that was a sufficient reason for a man who understood the difference between trust and superstition. In 1985, his neighbor, Gus Felton, made an offer for the South pasture. Gus was a year older than Roy and had farmed the adjacent property since his own father passed it to him. And he had always had his eye on the Callum South acres, because they were good bottomland, and he knew it. He made a fair offer. Roy said no. Gus stood at the fence line between their properties and said that was the most stubborn decision he had ever heard of. And what was the point of holding ground you weren't working to its potential? Roy said he appreciated the offer. Gus said something under his breath that Roy heard but did not respond to and drove back down the county road in a cloud of gravel dust. In 1998, a representative from a hog operation in western Iowa drove down from Ames in a company truck and made a leasing proposal with a rate per acre that would have covered Roy's taxes and more. Roy opened the door, listened to the first 30 seconds of the proposal, and said he was not interested in leasing the South acres. The representative said he had not even had a chance to get to the financial terms yet. Roy said he had enough information. He closed the door. In 2009, a company called Midwestern Wind Resources sent a man with a clipboard and a polo shirt that still had the crease from the packaging. He said the South acres of the Callum property were ideally positioned for a wind turbine installation, and that the company was prepared to offer a long-term lease arrangement with guaranteed annual payments, regardless of energy production. Roy took the clipboard. He looked at the first page of the proposal. He handed it back. He said no. The man said surely Roy would want to at least review the financial analysis. Roy said he had reviewed what he needed to review. In 2019, 3 weeks after Helen's funeral, a man Roy had never seen drove up the lane in a car with no identifying markings and knocked on the door. He said he represented a land acquisition group and had been authorized to make a cash offer for the South 120 acres, no contingencies, 30-day close. He named a number. Roy stood on the porch with his coat on because he had been outside when the car came up the lane, and he had not gone back inside. He looked at the man. He said no. The man asked if Roy would like to hear more about the offer. Roy said no. The man said surely after what Roy had been through recently, there might be some interest in liquidity. Roy looked at him for a long moment without saying anything. Then he turned and went inside. That was the only time Roy had felt uncertain about the instruction. Not because the offer was tempting, and not because he had forgotten what his father told him. It was because Helen had died 3 weeks before, and the farm was very quiet. In a way, it had not been quiet for 38 years. And standing on the porch watching a stranger drive back down the lane was the first time he had felt the full weight of what it meant to make decisions alone. He had gone inside. He had made coffee. He had sat at the kitchen table and looked at the window the way he was looking at it now on a Tuesday morning in March of 2025. Except that now the window held a different kind of gray. And the weight of the decision was not solitude but urgency, which was a different thing and in some ways easier. He drove to Winterset. The Madison County Courthouse sat in the center of the town square, a brick building that had been there since 1876, which was longer than any of the institutions that currently operated inside it. Roy had been in the building perhaps 30 times in his adult life. He knew where the recorder's office was and where the assessor's office was and where the small conference rooms were on the second floor, where Frank had walked him through Helen's estate paperwork in the winter of 2019. He pulled into the parking lot at 9:22. Frank's car was already there. Frank was standing on the courthouse steps in his coat holding a cup of coffee from the Casey's and looking at his phone. He was 63 years old and had the build of a man who had once been heavier and had recently decided to do something about it. And the something about it had been walking, which showed in his posture more than his size. He looked up when Roy's truck pulled in. Roy walked over with the tube. Frank looked at it. He said, "Is that what I think it is?" Roy said he expected it was. Frank set his coffee on the step railing and took the tube from Roy. He removed the cap. He slid the map out. He unrolled it against his knee, holding the corners with both hands, and read it for 90 seconds without speaking. Then he looked up. He said, "Roy, where has this been?" Roy said, "On a shelf, in a closet, since 1932. Frank was quiet for a moment. He said, "This stops the auction." Roy said he understood. Frank said, "But I have to be honest with you. They will fight it. They will argue the map is not authenticated. They will say whatever clerical record they found supersedes a hand-drawn survey from 93 years ago. We may be in court for a long time." Roy said he understood that too. Frank handed the map back. He picked up his coffee. He looked at the time on his phone. He said, "Then let's go inside and find out what we're dealing with." But before they went inside, Frank said he had made some calls from the car before Roy arrived. He had looked up Clearwater Title Group LLC in the Secretary of State's database. The company had been formed in Delaware in November of 2024, which was 4 months ago. It was a subsidiary of a larger acquisition firm called Apex Land Partners, which had a website that described its business as title arbitrage, the identification and acquisition of properties with disputed, ambiguous, or incomplete title records, which were then resolved through legal process and resold. Frank said he had also made a call to the Madison County Recorder's office at 8:30 that morning. The recorder had told him off the record that Clearwater had flagged a discrepancy in the 1956 filing related to the Callum South Acres. A clerical error in that filing had rendered the legal description of the South 120 acres technically incomplete under current recording standards. Clearwater's position was that the incomplete record created a cloud on the title that gave them a basis to file an adverse claim. Roy said, "A clerk made a mistake in 1956, and they are using it to take my land." Frank said, "That is what they are attempting, yes." Roy said, "How many times have they done this?" Frank paused. He said he had found 16 prior cases in the Apex Land Partners records that followed the same pattern across 4 Midwestern states. 16 properties, 16 families. In 14 of those cases, the owner had not known what was happening until it was over. He said there was something else. He said that Gus Felton, Roy's neighbor, had received a notice 3 weeks ago. Gus was 76 years old. He had no lawyer. He had not understood what the notice meant. He had signed a document presented to him by a Clearwater representative last Thursday, under the impression that he was agreeing to a title review process. He was not. He had signed a deed of conveyance. Roy stood on the courthouse steps in the March morning and looked across the town square, at the buildings on the far side, the hardware store and the insurance office and the diner where he had eaten breakfast with Helen more times than he could count. He said Gus lost his land. Frank said yes. Roy said, "What number is Clearwater calling this one?" Frank said, "You are number 17. Roy said, "Who is 18? Frank said, "A man named Norman Wiley, 79 years old, east side of the county. He received a notice last week." Roy said, "Then we need to handle this one correctly, because Norman Wiley is watching." Frank said he agreed. They went inside. The man from Clearwater was already in the lobby when they entered. His name was Marcus Webb. He was 36 years old and wore a charcoal jacket over a pale blue shirt and leather shoes that had no scuff on them and no mud, which was a thing Roy noticed. The way he noticed all details about a man the first time he saw him. Because a man's shoes told you something about the ground he thought he walked on. Webb was looking at his phone when they came through the door, and he looked up when the door opened, and he took in Roy and Frank with the practiced evaluation of someone who has spent time sizing up situations and considers himself good at it. He looked at Roy for a moment. Then he looked at the cardboard tube. Then he looked back at his phone. The auction was scheduled for 10 o'clock on the front steps of the courthouse. There were 11 people gathered by 9:58. 3 were investors, one of whom Roy recognized as a man named Deacon, who had been buying up farm parcels in Madison County for several years. 2 were neighbors who had seen the notice and come to watch. The rest were courthouse employees on a smoke break or a coffee break who had drifted out to see what was happening. The auctioneer's name was Grady Birch. He had been running public auctions in Madison County for 28 years. Roy had been to several of his auctions over the years. Birch knew what he was doing, and he was fair, and he did not make things more complicated than they needed to be. At 10:02, Birch called the auction to order. He read the legal description of the south 120 acres of the Callum property. He opened the bidding at $400,000. Deacon bid $410. Roy raised his hand. Birch did not see him. He was looking toward the front of the group near the steps. Another bid came in at $425 from a man Roy did not recognize in a gray jacket. Roy raised his hand again. He was standing toward the left side of the gathered group, holding the tube against his side, wearing his brown coat and his regular hat, which was not a statement, but simply what he wore on cold mornings in March. Birch called $450. Frank stepped forward. He said, "Mr. Birch." Birch stopped. Frank said, "My name is Frank Arden. I am the attorney representing Roy Callum, the legal owner of the property currently being offered for sale. I am formally requesting that you halt this auction pending verification of a title defect in the seller's claim." Birch had run 28 years of auctions, and he had never had a lawyer step forward and say those words. He looked at Frank. He looked at Roy. He looked at Marcus Webb, who was standing to the right of the steps, with his arms crossed, and an expression that had tightened slightly. Birch said, "Sir, do you have documentation?" Roy walked forward. He uncapped the tube. He unrolled the 1932 Whitmore survey on the small folding table Birch had set up beside the podium. He used the tube and the corners of his coat to hold the paper flat against the March wind. He did not say anything. Birch looked at the map. He was not a surveyor and could not read it the way a surveyor would, but he could see that the lines on the map did not match the legal description he had just read aloud. And 28 years of running auctions had given him a precise instinct for the difference between a legitimate dispute and a nuisance. He set down his clipboard. Marcus Webb stepped forward. He said, "That document has not been authenticated. The seller has a recorded title, and the auction is proceeding under valid legal authority." From the side door of the courthouse, which was the door that opened onto the east alley and was used primarily by courthouse staff, a man in a tan uniform stepped out and walked toward the steps. His name was Dale Norris, and he had been the Madison County Sheriff for 16 years. And Frank Arden had called him at 9:45 from the parking lot of the courthouse and explained the situation in 4 sentences, which was all Norris had needed. Norris walked up to the auction table. He looked at the map. He looked at Birch. He said, "Grady, I'd like you to suspend this proceeding. There is a question of whether the seller has clear title to what is being offered. Until that question gets resolved, I am asking you not to complete this sale." Birch said, "The auction is suspended pending verification." Webb started to speak. Norris turned to him. He said, "Sir, I would like to see your identification." Webb produced a Texas driver's license. Norris wrote down the name. He wrote down the LLC. He wrote down the address on the license. He looked up at Webb. He said, "I expect the county attorney will want to speak with you." The bidders began to disperse. Deacon walked away without looking at anyone. The man in the gray jacket looked at his phone and left. The courthouse employees went back inside. Roy stood at the table and rolled the Whitmore map along its natural curl. He tied the string. He slid the map back into the tube and replaced the cap. He looked at Frank. Frank looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing to say yet. The auction was stopped. The next thing was the fight. And the fight was going to be longer than a morning on courthouse steps in Winterset, Iowa. They both knew that. They had both known it before they drove here. Roy tucked the tube under his arm. He looked at the front of the courthouse, at the brick that had been there since 1876, at the steps where generations of Madison County people had conducted the ordinary business of ownership and loss, and transfer the quiet transactions by which a community keeps track of what belongs to whom. He thought about his grandfather standing in this county in 1928, with a deed in his hand that did not accurately describe the ground he had paid for. He thought about the tube on the shelf for 44 years. He thought about Helen in the library in 2003, asking for the archive editions of the 1932 Gazette, copying the article, writing her note, folding it into an envelope and putting the envelope at the bottom of the wicker basket in her sewing room. He thought about the fact that 3 people across 3 generations had kept this particular piece of truth ready for a morning exactly like this one. He walked down the courthouse steps toward Frank's car. The Iowa sky above Winterset was still working out what it intended to be, which was the same thing it had been doing when Roy left the farm 2 hours ago. In his experience, the sky usually figured it out by noon. You just had to keep moving until it did. The courthouse hallway on the 2nd floor of the Madison County building smelled of old carpet and radiator heat, and the particular institutional coffee that has been sitting on a burner for too long. Roy knew this hallway. He had walked it the winter after Helen died, coming up for the estate paperwork, sitting in the small conference room at the end with Frank and a woman from the recorder's office, who had been patient and kind in the way that people in small county offices sometimes are, when they understand that the person across the table from them is not just managing paperwork, but managing grief at the same time. That had been 6 years ago. He walked it now with the tube under his arm, and Frank beside him, and the sound of their boots on the old floor the only sound in the corridor. The auction crowd had dispersed. Sheriff Norris had gone back inside after speaking briefly with Grady Birch and taking down Marcus Webb's information. Webb himself had disappeared from the courthouse steps before Roy and Frank came back through the front door, which Roy noted without comment. Frank had reserved the small conference room by phone on the drive over that morning. They went in and Frank set his briefcase on the table and opened it, and Roy set the tube on the table and they sat down across from each other. And Frank said, "All right, let me tell you what we are working with." He said that the suspension of the auction was a procedural win, but not a resolution. Grady Birch could suspend the auction, but he could not nullify the adverse claim Clearwater had filed with the county. That claim was still on the record. Clearwater had a recorded document asserting an interest in the South, 120 acres. And until that document was challenged and defeated in court, the auction could be rescheduled and the process could begin again. Roy said, "How long do we have before they can reschedule?" Frank said 30 days was the typical window before a suspended auction could be reinstated without a new filing. He said that gave them 30 days to challenge the adverse claim, which was not a lot of time for a quiet title action, but was enough time to file an emergency motion and request an injunction if they moved quickly. Roy said, "What do they have on their side?" Frank opened a folder. He said Clearwater's claim was based on the 1956 filing discrepancy, which was real. When Thomas inherited the property in 1956 and the county re-recorded the deed in the new name, a clerk had entered the legal description of the South 120 acres, using a shorthand notation that was technically incomplete under the recording standards that had been updated in 1952. The notation was not wrong in the sense of being fabricated, but it was incomplete in a way that created what title attorneys called a gap, a place in the chain of title where the description could be questioned. Clearwater's algorithm had found that gap in 11 minutes. Roy said, "And on our side we have the Whitmore map." Frank said yes, but he said they needed to be prepared for Clearwater to challenge the map's authenticity and accuracy. A hand-drawn survey from 1932 was not automatically accepted as controlling authority, particularly when the opposing party had a recorded deed and a team of lawyers who were experienced at exactly this kind of dispute. He said the first thing they needed to do was establish the Whitmore survey as a legitimate, authenticated document, which meant finding corroborating records that confirmed R.L. Whitmore had been a licensed surveyor in Madison County in 1932, and that the map Roy had was genuine. Roy said Helen's note says there was a 1932 article in the Gazette about the survey. Frank said he had already called the Madison County Library that morning before coming to the courthouse, and a librarian named Doris had pulled the September 1932 archive. The article was there. R.L. Whitmore was identified by name and credentials. The survey was described as having resolved a boundary question on the Callum property in the landowner's favor. That was corroboration of a kind, but it was a newspaper article, not a legal record. He said what they really needed was Whitmore's own records, the field notes, the survey books, the instruments of record that a licensed surveyor was required to maintain. If those existed and could be located, they would be far stronger than a newspaper article or even the map itself, because they would show the methodology, the measurements, the raw data that Whitmore had used to draw the line. Roy said Whitmore has been dead for a long time. Frank said, yes, but surveyors' records were sometimes kept by family members or by county archives or by the professional organizations that licensed them. He said he had asked Doris at the library to look for any information about R.L. Whitmore in the county's historical records. He was waiting to hear back. They sat with that for a moment. Then Frank said, I also need to tell you something about Clearwater's operation that I found this morning. He said the 16 prior cases he had identified were spread across Iowa, Illinois, Minnesota, and Nebraska. In every case, the pattern was the same. An automated title search identifies a gap or discrepancy in a county recording. Clearwater files an adverse claim. They publish notice in the legal announcements section of the local paper, using the minimum legally required notification. And they send certified mail to the address of record, which in older filings is often outdated. The landowner frequently does not know the auction is happening until it is too late. Roy said McCallum gave the county the wrong description in 1928. Frank said yes. Roy said, and in 1956, the clerk entered it wrong again. Frank said yes. Roy said, so Clearwater found a mistake that is 97 years old, and they used it to try to take my ground. Frank said that was an accurate description of what had happened. Roy looked at the tube on the table. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking. He said, my grandfather knew in 1928 that the description was wrong. That is why he hired Whitmore. Frank said, I know. Roy said he did not make the mistake. The mistake was made for him. Frank said, that is also true, and it is the argument we are going to make. The door to the conference room opened, and a woman put her head in and told Frank there was someone in the lobby who wanted to speak with him. Frank excused himself. Roy sat alone in the conference room with the tube and the map and George's note and Helen's 2 pieces of paper, which he had arranged in a line on the table in front of him. He looked at the 4 documents. A note from his grandfather written in 1932, a survey map from the same year, a newspaper article photocopied in 2003, a note from Helen also from 2003, 4 pieces of paper separated by decades, 4 pieces of paper that had found each other on a sewing table in a farmhouse in Madison County on a Tuesday morning in March 97 years after the first one was written. He thought about Marcus Webb. Webb had been on the courthouse steps for perhaps 20 minutes total, and in that time he had been photographed, identified, and asked for documentation by the county sheriff, which Roy suspected was not how Webb's morning had been planned. He thought about the kind of man who built a business on finding other people's clerical errors and using them to take property that those people's families had worked and paid for and maintained for generations. He thought about what that work felt like from the inside, whether it felt like anything at all, or whether it had become simply a process, a series of steps, an algorithm generating targets and the targets generating outcomes, and the outcomes generating revenue, without any particular awareness of the specific life that was on the other end of each transaction. He thought it probably felt like the second thing. He thought that was the only way you could do it 16 times. Frank came back into the room. He said that was Sheriff Norris. He has asked Marcus Webb to remain available for questioning, and Webb has said he will cooperate. Norris has also been in contact with the county attorney's office. They are looking at the notification procedure Clearwater used, specifically whether the certified mail sent to the Callum property address was sent to the correct current address or to an outdated one from the historical filing. Roy said, what address did they use? Frank looked at his notes. He said the certified mail had been sent to Rural Route 3 Box 14, Winterset, Iowa. He said that had been the Callum mailing address until the rural route system was converted to physical addresses in 1979. Roy's current address was a numbered county road address. The 1979 conversion had been documented in the county records, but the 1956 deed filing still reflected the old root box address, and that was the address Clearwater's system had retrieved and used. Roy said they sent the notice to an address that stopped existing 46 years ago. Frank said they sent it to the address their system found. Their system found the 1956 record. The 1956 record had the old address. Their system did not check whether that address was still current. Roy said nothing for a moment. Then he said Helen used to say that there was a difference between knowing and checking. She said most people think knowing is enough, but it isn't, because knowing gets old and checking stays current. Frank said she was right about that. Roy said Webb's system knew the address. It did not check the address. Frank said no, it did not. They drove to the county attorney's office at 11:30, where they spent 90 minutes going through the documentation and establishing the formal basis for challenging the adverse claim. The county attorney was a woman named Patricia Greer, who had been in the office for 8 years and who listened to everything Frank presented without interrupting, and then asked 4 precise questions and said she would have a draft motion ready by end of day Thursday. Roy sat in the chair beside Frank's chair and did not say much. He answered when Greer asked him questions directly about the history of the property, about his father's instructions about the 4 occasions on which he had declined to sell the South Acres. He spoke in the plain, factual way he spoke about most things, without elaboration, but without omission. When Greer asked him about the tube and where it had been kept, he described the shelf in the closet in Helen's sewing room. She asked how long it had been there. He said since 1981, when his father gave it to him. She asked whether he had ever opened it before this morning. He said no. She said, "You kept a sealed tube in a closet for 44 years without opening it on the instruction of your father, without knowing what was inside." Roy said yes. She said, "Why?" Roy said, "Because my father told me the south half mattered, and the reason was in the tube." That was enough. Greer wrote something on her notepad. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she moved on to the next question. They were back at this courthouse by 2 o'clock. Frank needed to file a formal notice of appearance in the recorder's office, and Roy sat in the truck in the parking lot and ate the sandwich he had made at 6 in the morning and brought in his coat pocket, because it was the kind of thing he still did out of habit. Made his lunch before he drove anywhere because Helen had started the habit, and he had continued it after she died without deciding to continue it, the way you continue the habits of someone you miss without choosing to. He was still in the truck when Frank came back out. Frank got in the passenger side. He had a look on his face that Roy recognized as the look of a man who has received information that changes the shape of something. Frank said, "The library called." Roy said, "Doris." Frank said, "Yes. She found something in the county's historical professional records archive. R.L. Whitmore was licensed as a surveyor in Madison County from 1919 to 1951. He died in 1953. She found his name in the licensing rolls for those years, and also in the record of a professional association he belonged to, the Iowa State Association of Licensed Land Surveyors." Roy said, "Did she find his records?" Frank said, "That is the thing. She found a notation in the association's 1953 death records that upon the death of a member, the association requested that the member's professional papers be preserved by a family member or donated to the County Historical Society. The notation for Whitmore said that his professional records had been retained by a family member at an address in Winterset." Roy said, "What family member?" Frank said, "A grandson." The notation listed the grandson's name as Calvin Whitmore. Roy said, "Is he still in Winterset?" Frank said Doris looked him up in the current county directory. There is a Calvin Whitmore listed at an address on the south side of Winterset. She called the number. He answered. He is 68 years old, and he is R.L. Whitmore's grandson. And he told Doris that yes, he still has his grandfather's surveying records. He keeps them in his equipment shed. He said nobody has asked about them in 40 years. Roy and Frank sat in the truck for a moment. Roy said, "Does he still have the 1932 Callum survey records?" Frank said, "He thinks so." He said he has not gone through everything in the last several years, but he remembers the boxes are there. He said if someone wanted to come by this afternoon, he would pull them out and take a look. Roy said, "Then let's go." Calvin Whitmore lived in a house on Sycamore Street on the south side of Winterset. A white frame house with a detached two-car garage, and behind the garage a metal equipment shed the size of a small barn. He was 68 years old and had the build of a man who had spent most of his life outdoors doing physical work, wide in the shoulders and careful in his movements. He met them in the driveway. He shook Roy's hand and said he had been sorry to hear about Helen, which told Roy that Calvin Whitmore was the kind of man who kept track of the community around him, because Helen had been gone 6 years and most people had stopped offering condolences 2 years ago. Calvin said his grandfather had told him about the survey work on the Callum farm. He said R.L. Whitmore had talked about it more than once over the years, had mentioned it as one of the cases where he had been certain of his measurements and had felt the work mattered beyond the technical execution of it, because there was a family whose ground was at stake, and getting the line right was the difference between what they had paid for and what they had been given. They went into the equipment shed. It was orderly in the way of a man who uses a space for real work and organizes it to serve that use rather than to appear organized. Tools hung on the wall in their places. A workbench ran along the far wall with its surface clear, except for a lamp and a vise. Along the south wall, shelving held a series of archive boxes, the kind with lids labeled in a hand Roy did not recognize, which must have been R.L. Whitmore's. The labels were faded but legible. They were organized by year. Calvin found the boxes for 1931 and 1932 and brought them to the workbench. He opened the 1932 box first. Inside were field notebooks of the kind that professional surveyors use, small cloth-bound books with graph paper pages, each entry dated and identified by property and client name. Calvin flipped through them until he found a notebook labeled Spring 1932 and opened it to the section on the Callum property. The field notes were in R.L. Whitmore's hand. They were detailed and precise in the way that a man's professional records are precise when he understands that his records are his reputation. Every measurement was listed. Every instrument reading was recorded. The calculations were shown in full. At the end of the Callum section, there was a summary page that identified the discrepancy between the county's recorded boundary and the boundary established by Whitmore's survey, with the specific difference annotated in feet and fractions of feet. At the bottom of the summary page, in slightly different ink as if it had been added later, was a note. It said, "Informed County Recorder of Discrepancy, October 4th, 1932. Told correction would require legal process. Advised client to retain map." Client acknowledged. Roy read that note twice. His grandfather had not simply been told the county records were wrong. He had accompanied Whitmore to the county recorder's office. They had reported the discrepancy together. The county had told them the correction would require a legal process they could not afford. And George Callum had gone home and put the map in a tube and told his son not to sell the south half. He had not been passive. He had taken the correct step. The system had told him the step was not sufficient. and the next step was beyond his means. So he had done the only other thing available to him, which was to document it correctly and keep the documentation and trust that the next generation would have access to what this generation did not. Frank was standing at Roy's shoulder, reading the same note. He said quietly that this changed the legal picture considerably. He said the notation that the county had been informed of the discrepancy in 1932 meant that the error in the county's records was not simply a mistake that had persisted unnoticed. It was a mistake that had been reported and not corrected. That was a different category of error, and it had different legal implications for Clearwater's claim. Calvin Whitmore asked if the records were helpful. Frank said they were more than helpful. Calvin said his grandfather had believed in keeping records because he believed the work he did had consequences that lasted beyond the immediate transaction. He said R.L. Whitmore used to tell him that a surveyor's work was about property, but it was also about justice because property lines were where neighbors met and where disputes began and where the difference between a fair outcome and an unfair one was often a matter of whose measurements you trusted. Roy said, "Your grandfather was right." Calvin said he knew it. They took photographs of the field notebook pages with Frank's phone. Calvin offered to bring the box to the county attorney's office the following morning, and Frank said that would be extremely helpful, and they agreed on a time. It was past 4 o'clock when Roy and Frank drove back toward the courthouse. The March afternoon was doing something it sometimes did in Iowa, which was to turn briefly golden in the late afternoon after a gray day, as if it was offering a small apology for the morning. The light on the fields along the county road was the particular low gold of early spring when the ground is still mostly brown. But the light treats it as if it has already become something else. Roy looked at the fields as they drove. He said, "Gus Felton signed papers." Frank said yes. Roy said he didn't know what he was signing. Frank said, "That is my understanding." He was told it was a title review process. Roy said, "Is there anything to be done?" Frank said he had been thinking about that. He said that if the adverse claim against Roy's property was successfully challenged, it would establish a legal record that Clearwater's method of identifying and claiming properties based on recording discrepancies was being contested. That would create problems for any similar claim Clearwater had pursued or was pursuing in the county. He said it might provide grounds for Gus to challenge his own conveyance on the basis that the representation Clearwater made to him about the nature of the document was misleading. Roy said, "So if we win ours, Gus might have a path back." Frank said it was possible. He said he did not want to overstate it because Gus had signed a deed, and undoing a signed deed was harder than preventing one from being completed. And he did not know the specific terms of what Gus had signed. He said he would need to look at it before saying more. Roy said, "Find out." Frank said he would. They pulled into the courthouse parking lot. Frank had more filing to do. Roy said he would wait in the truck. He sat there for a while with the engine off, and the March air coming through the window he had cracked 2 inches. Which was the temperature at which Iowa air in early spring is cold enough to be useful, and not so cold as to be punishing. He thought about Marcus Webb. Webb had been at the courthouse steps for the auction. He had argued for the auction to proceed. He had said the Whitmore map had not been authenticated, and the sale was proceeding under valid legal authority. He had said this with the confidence of someone who has done this before, and knows how the steps go, and expects the steps to go the same way this time. Roy thought about what Webb had not known when he said those things. He had not known about George's note in the tube. He had not known about Helen's envelope in the wicker basket. He had not known that the article Helen had found in 2003 included Whitmore's name and the notation of the survey's resolution. He had not known that R.L. Whitmore had a grandson in Winterset, who kept an equipment shed organized by year, and who had a field notebook from 1932 with a note at the bottom that said the county recorder had been informed of the discrepancy and told them a legal process was required. Webb's algorithm had found the gap in the 1956 filing in 11 minutes. It had found exactly what it was looking for, which was a gap, a technical deficiency in a recorded document that created room for an adverse claim. It had found the gap because it had been trained to look for gaps. It had not been trained to look for what closed the gap. It had not searched for surveying records in a shed on Sycamore Street, because those records were not in any database it could access. It had not searched for a wicker basket on a sewing table because that was not the kind of place a system looked for legal evidence. It had not read a handwritten note on the bottom of a field notebook page from 1932 because that page had never been scanned or digitized or entered into any system that Webb's algorithm could reach. The technology was fast, and it was thorough within its domain, and its domain was everything that had been converted into data and stored in a form that a system could search. Its domain did not include the things that people kept, because they understood the things were important, the things that sat on shelves in closets and in boxes in equipment sheds, and at the bottom of wicker baskets in sewing rooms. The things that existed outside the digital record because they had been created before the digital record existed, and no one had thought to bring them into it. Roy thought that Webb had built his entire business on the assumption that what was not in the system did not exist. He had been wrong about that assumption 16 times without knowing he was wrong. He had arrived at the courthouse steps this morning still holding that assumption, still confident in it, still certain that a 74-year-old farmer in a brown coat with a cardboard tube was a routine transaction and a routine process. Roy wondered what Webb was doing right now. At 4:15 on a Tuesday afternoon in Madison County, Iowa, he suspected Webb was on the phone. He suspected the conversation was not comfortable. Frank came back to the truck at 4:40. He got in and said the filings were done and Patricia Greer had called to say she had received the documentation Frank had sent over, and she had moved their case to priority status given the 30-day auction reinstatement window. He said Greer had also told him something else. He said that the county attorney's office had received a call at 3:30 from a law firm in Des Moines representing Clearwater Title Group, LLC. The firm had indicated that Clearwater was prepared to discuss a resolution of the matter and wanted to schedule a call with the county attorney and Roy's representative by end of week. Roy said, "What kind of resolution?" Frank said they did not specify, but in his experience when the opposing party called the county attorney's office to discuss resolution within 6 hours of having their auction stopped by a sheriff, it meant they had looked at what had just happened and had decided they did not want to go further with this particular case. Roy said, "Why not?" Frank said, "Because we have the Whitmore map. We have the 1932 Gazette article. We have Helen's note confirming the map is real. We have Cal Whitmore coming in tomorrow with his grandfather's field books. And we have a county attorney who is now aware that Clearwater's notification procedure used a 46-year-old address. That is not a case Clearwater wants to try in a Madison County courtroom in front of a Madison County judge, with Roy Callum sitting at the petitioner's table." Roy was quiet for a moment. He said they thought my grandfather's mistake was their opportunity. Frank said they thought a clerk's error in 1956 was their opportunity. Yes. Roy said my grandfather didn't make a mistake. He paid for the line and he documented the line. The mistake was made by the people who recorded it wrong in the first place, and then refused to fix it when he told them it was wrong. Frank said, "Yes." Roy said, and Clearwater found the clerk's error and called it a gap and said the gap gave them a right to what was behind it. Frank said, That is what they did. Roy said, but what was behind the gap was not an empty space. It was 93 years of documentation. It was my grandfather's note and Whitmore's map and Helen's envelope and Calvin Whitmore's shed. Frank said, yes. That is exactly what was behind it. Roy looked out the windshield at the parking lot and the courthouse beyond it and the town square beyond that. The ordinary geography of a county seat in the middle of Iowa on a Tuesday afternoon in March. A place where people brought their deeds and their disputes and their paperwork and asked the institution to keep track of what mattered. He said, what do you recommend? Frank said, I recommend we take their call. I recommend we listen to what they propose. I recommend we not resolve anything that involves the South Acres without ensuring it is recorded correctly this time. And I recommend we ask before anything else is discussed what they intend to do about Gus Felton. Roy said, we ask about Gus first. Frank said, we ask about Gus first. Roy said, good. He started the truck. He pulled out of the parking lot. He drove back down the county road toward the farm past the same fields he had driven past that morning. The same brown ground and the same fence lines, and the same grain bins catching what was left of the afternoon light. The sky had made up its mind sometime in the last hour, and had decided on a thin, cold blue that would hold until dark. He thought about George Callum driving this same road in the fall of 1932, coming back from the county recorder's office with R.L. Whitmore's map in hand, having been told that the correction would require a legal process he could not afford. He thought about what that felt like to have done the right thing, and to have been told the right thing was not enough, that more was required, that the more was beyond reach. He thought about George going home and making a different calculation, not the calculation of defeat, and not the calculation of surrender. The calculation of a man who understands that some things cannot be resolved in the season they occur, and must be prepared for the season when they can. The calculation that said, I cannot fix this now, but I can make sure the truth is preserved until someone can. Roy drove. The farm came into view around the last curve of the county road, the white of the buildings visible from a quarter-mile out, the way they had always been visible from that particular spot on the road, the way his father and his grandfather had seen them from that same spot for decades before him. The South Acres were behind the buildings, running south to the fence line Whitmore had surveyed the line George had paid for, and documented and trusted his descendants to hold. Roy pulled up the lane and parked. He sat in the truck for a moment. He thought about tomorrow. He thought about Cal Whitmore bringing the field notebooks to Patricia Greer's office. He thought about the call with Clearwater's lawyers and what they would propose and what he would say about Gus. He thought about the 30-day window and what needed to happen inside it. Then he thought about Norman Wiley, 79 years old, on the east side of the county, who had received a notice last week and did not have a lawyer, and did not yet understand what was coming for him. He thought about that for a long time. Then he got out of the truck and went inside to find Norman Wiley's phone number. Norman Wiley lived on the east side of Madison County on a property his family had farmed since 1941. 80 acres of decent ground, with a creek bottom that flooded in wet springs and a ridge field that dried out too fast in July, but that Norman had learned to manage the way you learn to manage anything. You have lived with long enough, which is to say, by understanding its particular character and working with it rather than against it. He was 79 years old. He had lost his wife, Margaret, to a stroke in 2021. He had 2 sons, one in Omaha and one in Phoenix, neither of whom farmed. He leased his ground to a neighbor's operation and lived in the farmhouse by himself, which he managed adequately and without complaint, because complaint was not something Norman Wiley had ever found particularly useful. Roy reached him by phone at 7:15 on Tuesday evening after he had eaten supper, and washed the dishes and sat at the kitchen table for a while, thinking about how to begin the conversation. He had Frank's help in identifying the right approach. Frank had said to be direct and plain, and not to alarm Norman more than the situation required, because an alarmed 79-year-old man with no lawyer and a notice he did not understand was already carrying enough and did not need more weight added to the pile unnecessarily. Norman answered on the third ring. Roy told him who he was and where his farm was, and that he had heard about the notice Norman had received the previous week. He said he had some experience with the company that sent it, and he wanted to talk to Norman about what it meant and what his options were. Norman was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought it was something I had to sign." Roy said, "It is not something you have to sign." He said Norman should not sign anything until he had spoken with a lawyer. He said he could connect Norman with Frank Arden, who was handling Roy's own situation with the same company and who could take a look at Norman's notice and tell him exactly what he was dealing with. Norman said, "Is my land in trouble?" Roy said, "Not tonight, not this week. But you need someone looking at this properly before anything moves further." Norman said, "I don't have a lot of money for lawyers." Roy said Frank would talk to him about that. He said he did not want Norman to worry about the money part yet. He said the important thing tonight was that Norman did not sign anything that came from Clearwater Title Group or from anyone representing them. Norman said the man who came out last week seemed very sure of himself. Roy said they usually do. Norman said he had papers with official-looking stamps on them. Roy said, "I know the kind. Don't sign them." There was a pause on the line. Then Norman said, "Roy, do you mind me asking why you are calling me? You don't know me well." Roy said, "Your farm is your farm, Norman. It is not their farm. That is why I am calling." Norman said he understood. He said he would call Frank Arden in the morning. Roy said good. He gave him Frank's number. He said he would check in later in the week. He ended the call and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the house for a while. The kitchen was lit by the overhead light, and the window over the sink was a dark rectangle showing nothing but the reflection of the room itself back at him, the table and the chair, and his own hands around the coffee cup. He thought about the man who had driven out to Norman Wiley's farm last week with papers with official-looking stamps on them and said what he said with confidence and certainty, knowing that an elderly man alone on a property with no lawyer and no recent experience with this kind of transaction was the most likely kind of person to sign what was put in front of him. He thought about that as a business model, the deliberate targeting of the most vulnerable transaction, the one where the opponent was least equipped and most isolated. He thought about the 16 cases Frank had found. He thought about how many cases Frank had not found. He did not stay with that thought long. Staying with it was not going to help Norman Wiley or Gus Felton or anyone else. What was going to help was the call with Clearwater's lawyers on Thursday, and the filings Patricia Greer was preparing, and Cal Whitmore's field notebooks arriving at the county attorney's office in the morning. He went to bed at 9:30, which was when he always went to bed, because the farm had trained him to a schedule over 50 years, and the schedule held whether he had spent the day working the ground or sitting in courthouse hallways. He slept better than he expected to. Cal Whitmore arrived at Patricia Greer's office at 9 o'clock Wednesday morning with 2 archive boxes and the careful manner of a man who understands that what he is carrying matters. Frank was already there. Roy came in at 9:10, having driven from the farm after checking on the equipment shed and doing the 2 things that needed doing on a Wednesday morning regardless of what else was happening, because the farm did not pause for litigation any more than it paused for weather. Greer had cleared her morning. She sat at her conference table and looked through the field notebooks while Cal talked her through how his grandfather had organized his records and what the notation system meant, and how to read the measurements in context of the surveying practices of the 1930s. She asked precise questions and wrote down the answers, and did not appear to find any of it surprising, which was the quality Roy had noticed about her from the beginning, that she absorbed information without visible reaction and processed it into something useful. The key pages were the summary sheet with the notation about informing the county recorder in October of 1932, and the field notebook pages showing the raw measurements and calculations that Whitmore had used to establish the correct boundary. Greer photographed everything with a scanner the size of a notebook that she kept on the table beside her. The copies went into Roy's file and into a secure digital folder she maintained for the case. She said the field notebook notation about the county recorder was significant. She said it established that the discrepancy between Whitmore's survey and the county's recorded description was not a quiet, private matter that George Callum had simply chosen not to pursue. It was a discrepancy that had been formally reported to the county in 1932, and that the county had declined to correct on the basis that the correction required a legal process. She said that changed the character of the error from a passive recording mistake to an acknowledged, unresolved dispute. She said it also created a question about Clearwater's claim in a way that was useful to Roy's case. Clearwater's adverse claim was premised on the idea that the 1956 recording discrepancy created a cloud on Roy's title. But if there was a 1932 county record showing that the boundary had been disputed, and the county had been informed, and then Clearwater's position was not that they had discovered an unknown defect. It was that they had tried to exploit a dispute that was already on record, and that had already been resolved in the landowner's favor by a licensed surveyor. Roy said, "Can you prove the dispute was resolved in our favor?" Greer said, "The Whitmore survey, the field notebooks, the 1932 Gazette article, and George's own note collectively established that the correct boundary had been established and documented." She said it was not a court judgment, and it was not a recorded correction, which was where Clearwater would push back. But it was a substantial body of corroborating evidence, and it was enough to make their claim very difficult to sustain in front of a judge. She said, "I want to be honest with you, Mr. Callum. This is strong. It is not certain. A quiet title action is a legal process, and legal processes have uncertainty. But I have handled a number of these over 8 years, and the cases I have seen go wrong for the landowner are the cases where the documentation is thin or non-existent. Your documentation is not thin." Roy said it has had 93 years to accumulate. She said, yes, it has. The call with Clearwater's legal team happened Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. Frank was in Greer's conference room with Roy. On the other end of the line were 2 lawyers from the Des Moines firm, and after a moment's introduction, a voice Roy had not expected, which was Marcus Webb. Webb was on the call as a representative of Clearwater Title Group, which Frank had anticipated, but Roy had not. He sounded different on the phone than he had looked on the courthouse steps on Tuesday morning. The confidence was still there, but it had a different quality. The quality of a man who is managing a conversation carefully, rather than the quality of a man who is certain of the outcome. The lead lawyer from Des Moines said Clearwater had reviewed the materials that had been presented at the courthouse and subsequently filed with the county attorney's office, and was prepared to discuss a resolution of the matter that was satisfactory to all parties. Frank said before they discussed resolution, Roy had questions about Gus Felton. There was a brief pause on the line. The lawyer said that the Felton transaction was a separate matter from the Callum case and was not within the scope of this call. Frank said Roy's participation in this call was contingent on addressing the Felton situation as part of any resolution discussion. He said he could be clear about that at the outset so no one's time was wasted. Another pause, longer this time. Then the lawyer said they could discuss the Felton matter as part of a broader resolution framework. Frank said, "Good." Roy sat back in his chair and looked at the window. The March sky outside was doing something new that morning, which was to make a genuine argument for spring pale blue, with a quality of light that was warmer than what the temperature warranted. He looked at it while the lawyers talked. He listened to what was being said, but did not feel the need to participate yet. Frank knew what Roy wanted, and Frank was asking for it. The framework Clearwater proposed was this. They would withdraw the adverse claim against Roy's property with prejudice, meaning they could not refile it. They would acknowledge in writing that the 1932 Whitmore survey established the correct boundary of the south 120 acres, and that the 1956 recording discrepancy did not constitute a cloud on Roy's title. They proposed a payment to Roy of $200,000 as settlement for the costs and damages associated with the wrongful claim. In exchange, they asked for a release of any further civil claims Roy might bring related to the matter, and a confidentiality provision regarding the terms of the settlement. Frank said Roy was not agreeable to a confidentiality provision. He said the matter was already in the public record, and Roy had no interest in limiting what could be said about it. There was a discussion. The confidentiality provision was removed from the proposal. Frank said the payment amount was insufficient given the nature of the claim and the pattern of behavior Clearwater had exhibited across 16 prior cases. There was a longer discussion. The number moved. Roy did not watch the number move with particular attention because the number was not the point. The point was what came next, which was the Felton question. Frank said, "With respect to Gus Felton, Roy's position is that any resolution of the Callum matter must include a full review of the Felton transaction and a commitment from Clearwater to return the Felton property if the transaction cannot be shown to have been entered into with full and informed consent." The line was quiet for a moment. Webb's voice came through clearly. He said the Felton transaction was a completed conveyance with proper documentation. He said Mr. Felton had signed a deed. Frank said Mr. Felton had been told he was signing a title review document and had not understood he was signing a deed of conveyance. He said that if Clearwater's representative had represented the document as something other than what it was, the transaction might be voidable on the grounds of misrepresentation. Webb said, "That is not what the record shows." Frank said, "Then let's look at the record together." With the county attorney present, a silence on the line that had a particular texture. The texture of people on the other end, putting a phone on mute and having a conversation that the people on this end were not meant to hear. Roy looked at the window. The sky was still blue. A crow was working the field across the road, making the methodical passes that crows make when they know where they are going. The mute ended. The lead lawyer said Clearwater was prepared to agree to an independent review of the Felton transaction, with a commitment to reverse the conveyance if the review established that the nature of the document had been misrepresented to Mr. Felton at the time of signing. Frank looked at Roy. Roy gave a single nod. Frank said they would accept those terms as part of the resolution framework, subject to the specific language being reviewed and approved by the county attorney's office before signing. They ended the call at 11:45. The room was quiet for a moment. Greer set her pen down. She said the review of the Felton transaction was not a guarantee that Gus would get his land back. She said misrepresentation claims in a completed conveyance were not simple, and Clearwater's lawyers would look for every technical argument available to them. But she said the commitment to the review meant that the matter would be examined by a neutral party under conditions where Clearwater was required to produce its documentation of the Felton signing. And if that documentation showed what Frank believed it showed, there was a real path. Roy said, "What do you need from me to help Gus?" Greer said, "Whatever you know about the conversation Gus had with Clearwater's representative, whether you spoke to him before or after, any witnesses who might have been present, anything Gus told you about how the document was described to him." Roy said, "I did not speak to Gus before. He had already signed. Frank told me what happened based on what he found in the public record. He said, 'But I can go talk to Gus.' Frank said I would hold off until I make contact first in my professional capacity. He said it was better if Gus understood the legal framework before having a conversation with a neighbor about it, because the conversation would go better if Gus was not frightened and had some understanding of what was possible." Roy said, "All right, you go first. I'll go after." He drove home. He spent the afternoon doing what needed doing on the farm, which in March meant checking the drainage in the south field, where a tile line had been running slow since the fall, and looking at the equipment that would need to be ready when the ground thawed enough to work. The work was the same work it always was, and it required the same attention. It always required, and Roy gave it that attention. Because the farm did not grade your focus based on what else was happening in your life. It required what it required. He thought about his grandfather while he worked. He thought about George Callum in the spring of 1932, walking the south boundary with R.L. Whitmore, watching Whitmore set up the transit and run the chain, and write down the numbers and arrive at the conclusion George had suspected for 4 years. He thought about what that moment felt like to be confirmed in what you had known, without being able to prove to have the measurement in hand, and to know it was right, and to go to the county with it, and to be told that right was not enough. He thought about George going home. He thought about George making the calculation that a man makes when the formal path is closed, and the informal path is what remains. Not the calculation of a man who has given up. The calculation of a man who understands the difference between a battle and a war, and who is deciding which one he is actually in. George had decided he was in the war. The battle was whether the county would correct the record in 1932. He had lost that battle. The war was whether the Callum family would hold the correct ground for as long as it took for the means to correct the record to become available. He had not lost that. He had simply postponed it in the only responsible way available to him, which was to document it perfectly and hand it forward. Roy pulled the drainage probe out of the soil at the south end of the tile line and confirmed that the blockage was about 30 feet from the outlet, which was what he had suspected, and that it could be cleared with the jetter before planting if the ground cooperated. He noted it in his field book. The same kind of cloth-bound field book his father had used, which Roy had started using in 1981 when he took over the farm, because it was the right tool for the purpose, and there was no need to use a different tool when the right one was available. He wrote the date and the location and the nature of the blockage and the proposed remedy. He wrote it in his own handwriting, which was less angular than George's and less precise than Whitmore's, but was his, and it would be in the book when the book was found by whoever found it. The settlement agreement was finalized in 3 meetings over the following 2 weeks. Greer handled most of it directly with Frank present at the sessions where Clearwater's Des Moines lawyers were in the room. Roy came to the signing meeting, which happened at Greer's office on a Monday morning in early April. The final number was $940,000 plus attorney's fees, and the cost of correcting the county records, which Clearwater agreed to pay directly. The adverse claim was withdrawn with prejudice, The 1932 Whitmore Survey was formally recognized in a supplemental deed record as establishing the correct boundary of the South 120 acres. The 1956 recording discrepancy was corrected in the county's official records. All of it was recorded publicly, which Roy had required, because a private resolution that left no public record was the same thing as letting the whole episode disappear. And the whole episode should not disappear. The review of the Gus Felton transaction had been conducted by an independent title attorney, appointed by agreement of both parties. The review took 11 days. The independent attorney found that the Clearwater representative who had met with Gus had described the document he presented as a title clarification form, not a deed of conveyance, and that the representative had told Gus that signing would initiate a review process, not transfer ownership. The independent attorney found that this description was inaccurate in a manner that constituted material misrepresentation under Iowa law. The conveyance was voided. Gus Felton got his land back. Roy heard about it from Frank on a Wednesday afternoon, a phone call that lasted 4 minutes. Frank laid out the finding and the outcome and said the county had already recorded the reversal. Roy said, "Good." He thanked Frank. He ended the call. He sat at the kitchen table for a while. He thought about Gus standing at the fence line in 1985, saying that holding ground you weren't working to its potential was the most stubborn decision he had ever heard of, driving away in a cloud of gravel dust. He thought about Gus at 76, alone in his farmhouse, looking at a document with official-looking stamps and signing it because a man in a suit told him he was supposed to sign it. He thought about what he was going to say when he drove over to Gus's place. He thought he was not going to say much. He thought he was going to knock on the door, and when Gus answered, he was going to say that he was glad the land was back where it belonged. He thought Gus would probably say something similar. He thought they might stand on the porch for a minute and look at the fields, the way men of their age and background stood on porches and looked at fields, which was the way of people who understand that the land is not a backdrop to the conversation, but is itself the conversation. He drove over on a Thursday afternoon. Gus came to the door in his work clothes, which was what Roy expected because Gus was always in his work clothes. He was 76 years old and had the face of a man who had been in the weather for 50 years and had not much minded it. He looked at Roy for a moment without speaking. Then he stepped back from the door and said, "Come in." They sat at Gus's kitchen table with coffee. The kitchen was similar to Roy's in the way that farmhouse kitchens in Madison County tended to be similar, built in an era when function was primary, and the function was clear, and the design followed directly from it. Gus said, "I didn't know what I was signing." Roy said, "I know." Gus said he was very smooth about it, the man who came out. He had all the right words. He made it sound like I was doing myself a favor. Roy said, "That is how they work." Gus said, 16 families. Roy said, "That is what Frank found in the public record. There may have been more." Gus was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a small rotation, not going anywhere, just something for his hands to do. He said, "You called Norman Wiley." Roy said Frank had handled Norman's case as an extension of Roy's own. He said Norman's property had not been formally claimed yet, and the challenge to Clearwater's Iowa operations had effectively stopped any further filings in the state while the investigation was ongoing. He said Norman had retained Frank, and Frank was monitoring the situation. Gus said, "I owe you." Roy said, "You don't owe me anything." Gus said, "You could have just handled your own." Roy said, "I handled what was in front of me." Gus looked at him. He said, "Roy, 40 years ago, I stood at your fence line and told you that holding on to the south half was the most stubborn decision I had ever heard of." Roy said he remembered. Gus said I was wrong about that. Roy said, "You didn't know what you didn't know." Gus said neither did those people, the ones who took the land. They didn't know what they were dealing with. Roy said no. They thought they had found an empty space. They didn't know what was filling it. Gus said what was filling it. Roy said a cardboard tube, and my grandfather, and Helen, and the man who sold it to my grandfather's grandfather, who ran a crooked line and thought it would hold forever. Gus looked at him for a moment. Then he did something Roy had not seen him do in 40 years of neighboring, which was to smile. Not a large smile. Not the smile of a man who has found something funny. The smile of a man who has understood something that had been just out of reach. He said, "Your grandfather would have liked knowing how it came out." Roy said, "I expect he would." They sat for a while longer. They talked about the drainage situation along the county road, which affected both their properties and had been a recurring issue since the road was regraded in 2019. They talked about the lease rates for the spring planting season and what the commodity projections looked like for fall. They talked about the ordinary business of neighboring, which was the same business it had always been, uninterrupted by the extraordinary thing that had just happened. Because extraordinary things did not change the ordinary business. They only confirmed why the ordinary business mattered. Roy drove home in the late afternoon. June came out from Des Moines on Sunday. She arrived at noon and they ate lunch together at the kitchen table, the same table Roy had been sitting at when she called 14 days ago with the news about the auction. The kitchen looked the same. The table looked the same. The window above the sink showed the same March going on April sky that it always showed at this time of year. The sky of a season in the process of becoming something else. After lunch, June said she wanted to walk the south fence line. Roy said he would come with her. They drove the lane to the south end of the property and parked where the lane ended at the old equipment gate. They went through the gate and walked south along the fence. The fence had been built by George in 1929, the year after he bought the property, built along the line he believed to be correct, before he had the means to confirm it. Most of the original posts were gone, replaced over the decades as they rotted or broke, but the line was the same line George had walked in 1929, and the same line Whitmore had confirmed in 1932. And the same line that was now recorded correctly in the Madison County records for the first time in 97 years. The south field was still dormant. The brown of waiting ground, the brown that would give way to green in another 4 or 5 weeks if the temperature cooperated. A hawk was working the air above the east end of the field. The slow, patient circles of a bird that has found the right thermal and is in no hurry to leave it. They walked all the way to the south corner. The corner post was new, put in 12 years ago, but the corner itself was the corner George had established. The point where the east fence met the south fence at the coordinates Whitmore had measured and recorded in the spring of 1932. Roy had been to this corner hundreds of times. He had checked the fence here every fall and every spring. The ordinary maintenance of a boundary that was his to maintain. He had never stood here thinking about what the corner meant beyond its immediate practical function. He stood here now and thought about it. June put her hand on the top of the post. She was wearing her work gloves, the kind she kept in the car for when she came to the farm, because she was the daughter of a farmer, and understood that a farm was a place where you used your hands and you protected your hands accordingly. She said, "Grandpa Thomas told you not to sell it, but he didn't tell you why." Roy said, "He told me the why was in the tube." She said, "And you believed him." Roy said, "Of course I believed him." She said, "For 44 years." Roy said, "He was my father." June was quiet for a moment. She was looking south, past the fence line, past the neighbor's field that began where the Callum ground ended out to the low ridge on the horizon that was the edge of the visible landscape from this particular spot in Madison County, Iowa. She said, "I have been thinking about what I'm going to tell my boys when the time comes." Roy said, "What have you decided?" She said, "I'm going to tell them about the tube. I'm going to tell them about great-great-grandpa George and the map and the night he figured out the line was wrong and what he did about it. I'm going to tell them about Thomas passing the tube without explaining it, and about you keeping it for 44 years without opening it. I'm going to tell them about Helen finding the article in the library and putting the note in the basket and never saying a word about it. She said, I'm going to tell them that the most important things a family owns are usually not the things that have a price. They are the things that somebody decided were worth keeping, worth documenting, worth handing forward, without a guarantee that the handing forward would ever amount to anything." Roy said, "That is a good thing to tell them." She said, "And then I am going to show them the tube." Roy looked at her hand on the post. He looked at the field. The brown patient ground the hawk still working its thermal to the east. He looked at the fence line running west toward the equipment gate and east toward the far corner, a line that had been where it was for 97 years, because a man in 1928 had paid for it and had known he had paid for it, and had refused to let the fact that the record said otherwise be the end of the story. He thought about Helen in the library in 2003, sitting at a microfiche reader or a table with a bound archive volume finding the September 1932 edition of the Madison County Gazette, reading the small notice about the Whitmore survey on the Callum property, understanding what it meant, making a copy, writing her note, going home and putting the envelope in the basket and covering it with yarn. He thought about the fact that she had done that 12 years before she died, which meant she had known for 12 years that the proof existed and was documented and was available if it was ever needed. And she had said nothing to Roy because Roy had not opened the tube, and she was not going to take that decision from him by telling him what was inside before he was ready. She had trusted him the way his father had trusted him. She had prepared for him the way his grandfather had prepared for his father. She had left what needed to be left in the place where he would find it when he needed to find it. And she had trusted the interval without anxiety and without explanation. He thought about the kind of love that looked like patience, the kind that did not announce itself, the kind that simply made sure the necessary things were in place and then got out of the way and let the person you loved be the person they needed to be. He said Helen knew. June said she knew a lot of things she didn't say. Roy said she always did. June said she trusted you to handle it. Roy said, I know. He stood at the corner post for a while longer. The hawk had moved off the thermal and was working a different line to the north lower, now hunting in earnest. The afternoon light was coming at the field at the angle it comes at in early April, long and low and warm, in a way that is more promise than fact, but is sufficient to live on until the fact arrives. Roy reached into his coat pocket. He had put George's note there that morning when he dressed, folded along its original folds, the paper soft with age, but the ink still legible, the angular handwriting of a man who had been 37 years old in 1932 and had understood that what he was writing would matter more after he was gone than it mattered in the moment he wrote it. He unfolded it. He read it once standing at the corner post of the south fence line of the property his grandfather had paid for in 1928. Then he folded it again along the same folds. He put it back in his pocket. He looked at the line of the fence running east and west from where he stood, the line that Whitmore had confirmed and George had trusted and Thomas had passed forward and Roy had held. And that was now for the first time in nearly a century. correctly recorded in the public documents of Madison County, Iowa. He thought about the settlement money. He had told Frank to put the majority of it in a trust for June and her sons. He had kept enough to cover the drainage work in the south field and the equipment that needed replacing before planting, and a reserve for the years when the weather decided not to cooperate, which was the kind of reserve every farmer needed and very few maintained. He had done this without telling June until after it was done, because it was his to decide and he did not think it required discussion. June had found out through Frank and had called Roy on a Thursday evening. She had said, "Pa, you didn't have to do that." He had said, he knew. She had said, "That is a significant amount of money." He had said he was aware of that. She had said, "Why did you?" He had thought about it for a moment. He had said, because George Callum paid for the line in 1928, and that money did not belong to Roy. It belonged to whoever came next. She had been quiet on the line for a long time. Then she had said, all right. He had not told her about the part where he called Norman Wiley. Frank had handled that. He had not told her about the conversation with Gus on the porch, or what Gus had said about 40 years ago, or the smile that was not a smile about something funny. Those things were not secrets. They were just the kind of things that did not require telling. June took her hand off the post. She said, "We should head back before it gets too cold." Roy said, "In a minute." She did not push. She stood beside him and they both looked at the field and the fence and the line of the horizon to the south and the particular quality of the late afternoon in early April. The Iowa sky doing what it does when it has finally decided what season it is and is no longer uncertain about it. Roy thought about 97 years. He thought about a man in the spring of 1928, walking a boundary he would spend 4 years worrying about and 14 years after that putting the proof in a tube. He thought about the tube on a shelf through the Depression and the war and the transformation of agriculture and the deaths of the men who had put it there. He thought about the tube in the closet of a sewing room through 38 years of a marriage and the 4 attempts and the Tuesday morning. He thought about what it meant to keep something correctly, not to hold it because you were afraid to let it go, not to keep it out of habit or stubbornness or the simple accumulation of years, to keep it because you understood what it was and what it represented and who would need it and when, and to keep it in a form and a place and a condition that would make it useful when that time arrived. George had understood that. He had not solved the problem. He had preserved the solution. Thomas had understood that. He had not explained the tube. He had passed it with the instructions sufficient to ensure it was kept. Helen had understood that. She had not opened the tube or told Roy what was in it. She had confirmed that the proof existed, documented the confirmation, and put it where Roy would find it when he needed it. Roy thought he understood it now in a way he had not understood it before this week. Not fully. Not in the way you understand something when you have lived through its completion, rather than simply inherited its middle. He thought that was the gift. Not the land, not the settlement, not the corrected record in the county's files. Though all of those things mattered and were real, the gift was the understanding of how it was done, the documentation, the patience, the trust placed in the next person without demanding that the next person do it the same way or on the same timeline, the keeping of things that needed to be kept, the letting go of the need to see the resolution yourself. George had not seen the resolution. Thomas had not seen it. Helen had come the closest dying with the knowledge that the proof was in the basket, but not knowing when or whether Roy would find it. Roy had found it. The line held. He turned from the fence and walked back toward the equipment gate. June walked beside him. They did not say anything. The field was to their left, and the fence was to their right, and the late afternoon light was at their backs, pushing their shadows long across the dormant ground toward the north. The long shadows of early April that told you spring was nearly here, and that the work of another season was about to begin. At the gate, Roy stopped and looked back at the corner post. He stood there for a moment. Then he went through the gate and pulled it shut behind him, and latched it the way it had always been latched, the way his father had latched it and his grandfather before that. A simple iron latch dropped into an iron ring, a closure that required no explanation and no ceremony. Some things are like that. Some things are kept and passed and held for as long as they need to be held, and when the holding is done and the line is confirmed and the record is correct and the ground is back where it belongs, the thing you feel is not triumph, and it is not relief. It is something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. It is the feeling of a balanced account. George Callum had paid for that line in 1928. He had paid in full on a spring morning when the Iowa sky was the color of something that intends to last. He had paid for it, and then he had drawn it correctly. And then he had put the proof in a tube and trusted his son to keep it. 97 years later, the line was still where he had put it. It had never moved. Some men build empires. Others just draw the line correctly the first time and raise children who understand why the line matters. And if they are very fortunate, if they have done the thing right and trusted the right people and kept the documentation in the right place, those children raise children who understand it too. And the line holds and the account balances and the ground stays where it was paid for season after season, long after the names of the men who paid for it have faded from everything except the cloth-bound notebooks in the archive boxes and the notes folded in coat pockets and the particular angle of the fence as it runs east from the corner post toward the horizon in the long light of an April afternoon in Madison County, Iowa.